When I first met Emma, she was like a breath of fresh air, charismatic, sharp, and with a wit that could disarm anyone. She had this way of making you feel like the most important person in the room, and when she looked at me, I felt like I could conquer the world. I was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. Back then, I didn't realize how much that fire could burn. We'd been married for 6 years, and from the outside, our life seemed like something out of a picture-perfect story. Emma was a designer, her creativity evident in the little touches she brought to our home, the thoughtful gifts she'd pick for friends, and the way she could turn a dull room into a masterpiece. I worked in real estate, spending long hours closing deals and managing clients, often driven by the desire to provide for the life we'd always envisioned. She had a warmth that lit up any room she walked into, and I, admittedly, had a quieter nature. While I thrived on structure and planning, Emma was spontaneous and free-spirited. Opposites attract, they say, and for a long time, I believed we balanced each other perfectly. If I was the anchor, she was the sail, pushing us forward, chasing dreams, and always reminding me to enjoy the journey. We weren't without our flaws. Emma had a tendency to seek attention, often flirting lightly in social situations. It didn't bother me at first. If anything, I chalked it up to her being sociable and charming. I, on the other hand, could be overly practical, sometimes to the point of neglecting the little things that make life special. Emma would joke about it, calling me too logical for my own good. But I always thought we complemented each other. Our friends were a close-knit group, and among them was Liam. He'd been my friend for over a decade, someone I trusted implicitly. Liam was the life of the party, charismatic and funny, with a magnetic energy that seemed to draw people in. He was single, which meant he had more time to spare than the rest of us, often crashing at our place for a drink or a meal. Emma seemed to enjoy his company, but I never thought twice about it. Liam was my friend. He was family. Looking back, I should have seen the cracks forming. Emma's restlessness, her subtle dissatisfaction with the life we had, and the way she sometimes grew distant. I thought it was a phase, something that all marriages went through. After all, we had built a life together, shared dreams, memories, and plans for the future. But it seems I didn't realize how quickly those dreams could unravel. Emma and I had built a comfortable rhythm to our lives, a mix of routines and rituals that seemed to work. We'd have our morning coffee together before I headed out for work, a tradition that felt grounding amidst the chaos of life. But in hindsight, even those moments started to feel strained. She seemed restless. Her laughter, once so genuine, began to feel forced, like she was performing rather than living in the moment. I'd notice her scrolling through her phone more often, her face lighting up in ways I hadn't seen in months. When I asked her about it, she'd brush it off with a smile, saying, "Just catching up with friends." We had our disagreements, of course, like any couple. Emma would tell me I was too focused on work, that I didn't spend enough time with her. And maybe she was right. Real estate was demanding, and I often came home exhausted, barely able to muster the energy for more than a casual dinner and some light conversation. I always thought there would be time to make it up to her, to plan a trip, go on more dates, or just sit and talk like we used to. I never realized how wrong I was. It wasn't just me who noticed the change in her. Our mutual friends started to comment on how distant she seemed. "Is everything okay with Emma?" a close friend asked me at a barbecue one weekend. I laughed it off, telling them she was probably just stressed with work. But the truth was, I didn't know. I hadn't asked. And then there was Liam. He'd always been charming, but lately, I noticed a shift in how Emma interacted with him. She laughed a little louder at his jokes, lingered a bit too long during casual conversations, and even invited him over when I wasn't around, something that didn't strike me as odd at the time. After all, Liam was my friend, someone I trusted like a brother. But one evening, I overheard a snippet of their conversation that left me uneasy. They were sitting in the living room while I finished some work upstairs. Emma laughed at something he said, and then I heard her say, "You always know how to make me feel better." It wasn't the words themselves, it was the tone. Soft, intimate. A tone I hadn't heard from her in a while. I paused, waiting for the conversation to continue, but it shifted back to something mundane, and I convinced myself I was reading too much into it. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The distance between Emma and me grew more palpable with each passing day. Our conversations became transactional, devoid of the warmth they once held. I found myself replaying moments in my head, her smiles, her laughter, her sudden need to stay late at work, or meet up with friends I'd never heard of before. It all started to feel like a puzzle I couldn't quite piece together. And yet, I held on to the belief that we could weather the storm, that this was just a rough patch, a temporary phase. Emma was my wife, the woman I'd vowed to love and cherish. I couldn't imagine a world where that wasn't enough. But deep down, a part of me was already bracing for impact. As the weeks went by, the rift between Emma and me became harder to ignore. It was in the little things. The way she'd avoid my gaze when I asked about her day, how her phone was suddenly always face down on the table, and the way her laughter, once bright and full of life, felt like it was meant for someone else. I tried to be patient, thinking this was a phase. "Emma, is everything okay?" I asked one night as we sat at the dinner table, the silence between us nearly deafening. She glanced up from her plate and gave me a tired smile. "I'm fine, just tired," she replied, her tone dismissive. "Work's been a lot lately." Her answers were always vague, always just enough to stop me from pushing further. And for a while, I let it slide. Maybe I didn't want to admit that something was wrong. Or maybe I was afraid of what I'd find if I dug too deep. Liam, on the other hand, seemed to be around more often than ever. He dropped by unannounced, always with some excuse, a drink, a favor, or a story he just had to share. Emma welcomed him with open arms, laughing and chatting with him in ways she no longer did with me. I told myself it was harmless. He was my friend. After all, he'd always been good at making people feel at ease. But then there were moments that felt off. Like the time I walked into the living room and found them sitting unusually close on the couch, their conversation abruptly halting when they noticed me. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Oh, just talking about a show we both watch," Liam said, flashing me his easy grin. Emma nodded along, but her body language betrayed a nervousness she couldn't quite hide. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Something was wrong. I knew it. I just didn't know how to prove it, or if I even wanted to. I decided to make an effort, to try to pull us out of whatever rut we were in. I started planning little surprises, flowers, her favorite takeout, even a weekend getaway. But every gesture was met with polite indifference. "You don't have to do all this," she said one night when I handed her a bouquet of lilies, her favorite. "I know you're busy with work." "It's not about work," I replied, trying to sound sincere. "It's about us." She gave me a half-smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, and kissed me lightly on the cheek. "Thanks," she said before retreating to the bedroom. I sat on the couch that night, staring at the darkened TV screen and trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. I thought about the life we'd built, the love we once shared, and the promises we made to each other. I thought about Liam, his easy charm and the way he seemed to fill the spaces I couldn't. The cracks in our marriage were no longer subtle. They were gaping wounds, and I was starting to realize that no amount of effort on my part could mend them. But what I didn't know then was just how deep those cracks went, or how close I was to discovering the truth that would shatter everything. The first sign that Emma had stepped across the invisible line came on an ordinary Thursday evening. I'd come home earlier than usual, hoping to surprise her with dinner from her favorite restaurant. As I walked into the house, the lights were dim, and I noticed her laughter floating down the hall. Not the laugh I'd grown used to lately, thin and distant, but a carefree, melodic one that I hadn't heard in years. Curious, I walked toward the sound and stopped just short of the living room. There she was, sitting on the couch with Liam. They were both leaning forward, close enough that their knees nearly touched. She had her wine glass in hand, and he was telling some story that had her absolutely enthralled. Her head tilted back as she laughed, her body angled toward him in a way that felt too intimate for my liking. "Hey," I said, stepping into the room. Emma startled slightly, but recovered quickly. "Oh, hey, you're home early," she said, her voice too casual. "Yeah, I thought I'd bring dinner," I replied, holding up the takeout bags. My eyes darted to Liam, who looked equally surprised. though his grin didn't falter. "Dinner? Nice," Liam said, standing up and stretching as though he'd been there for hours. "I should probably head out, though." "You don't have to," I said, forcing a smile. "There's plenty of food." "No, I've got a thing," he said, brushing off my offer. He turned to Emma. "Thanks for the chat, though. Always great catching up." Emma walked him to the door, and I watched as their conversation continued in hushed tones. The way she lingered as he stepped outside sent a pang of unease through me. "Did Liam need something?" I asked when she came back. She shrugged. "He just stopped by to check in. He's been feeling a bit down lately, so I thought I'd cheer him up." The way she said it was so nonchalant, but something about her tone felt rehearsed. Over the next few weeks, her behavior became more peculiar. She'd started spending more time out of the house, her excuses growing vaguer. "Just running errands," she'd say, or "meeting a friend for coffee." But when I'd ask who, she'd brush it off with, "You don't know them." Then there were the missed calls and unanswered texts. Once, when I couldn't reach her for hours, I finally asked outright, "Where were you?" She blinked, caught off guard. "The spa," she said. "I needed some time to decompress." When I asked her which spa, her response was so delayed I knew she was lying. "That new one downtown," she mumbled, quickly changing the subject. It wasn't long before the pieces started to fall into place. I began noticing subtle changes in her. She paid more attention to her appearance, buying new clothes and wearing perfume she hadn't touched in years. She'd started keeping her phone close at all times, a stark contrast to how freely it used to lie on the counter or table. I'd catch her smiling at texts she'd quickly hide or hear her whispering into the phone when she thought I wasn't home. And then there were the late nights. "Don't wait up," she'd say, her tone light but her words heavy. Each time, I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. After all, this was Emma, my wife, my partner. But the doubts were growing louder in my mind, and no amount of denial could drown them out. One evening, I decided to test her. "How about we do something this weekend?" I suggested, trying to keep my tone light. Her response was immediate. "I can't. I've already got plans with the girls." "Oh? Which girls?" She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "You don't know them," she said again, brushing me off with a smile that no longer felt genuine. That was the night I started keeping track. Every excuse, every inconsistency, every strange behavior. It all went into a notebook I hid in my office. I didn't know what I was looking for, but deep down, I knew I'd find it. And I was right. The moment I saw her car parked outside Liam's apartment late one evening, any lingering doubts I had vanished. The trust I'd built over years of marriage shattered in an instant. I sat in my car, parked a few blocks away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they turned white. I watched as the lights in his apartment flickered on and saw her silhouette through the window. I didn't confront her that night. I wasn't ready. Instead, I drove home, my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. All I knew was that my life, our life, would never be the same. The days that followed were a blur of suspicion and heartache. I couldn't shake the image of Emma in Liam's apartment, the shadow of her silhouette illuminated by his window. My mind played a cruel loop of possibilities, each one worse than the last. I became hyper-aware of every interaction, every word, every movement she made. When she smiled at me, I wondered if it was genuine or if it masked guilt. When she kissed me goodbye in the mornings, I questioned whether she kissed him the same way. And when she said she loved me, I couldn't help but wonder if she was lying to my face. But I said nothing. I didn't know how to approach it, how to confront her without losing control of my emotions. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that there was some innocent explanation, even though the evidence was stacking up against her. Instead, I focused on gathering proof. I needed to know the truth, not just for closure, but so I could protect myself when everything inevitably came crashing down. One evening, while Emma was in the shower, I unlocked her phone. It wasn't difficult. We'd always trusted each other with our passwords. But as I scrolled through her messages, my stomach dropped. Most of the conversations were mundane. Chats with coworkers, updates from her family, but one stood out. It was under a name I didn't recognize, L, and the thread was unusually empty. Only a handful of messages remained, and they were cryptic at best. Can't wait to see you again. Tonight was amazing. I'm counting down the hours. My hands shook as I took screenshots and emailed them to myself. The texts weren't explicit, but they were enough to confirm my suspicions. And then there was the final straw. As I searched through her gallery, I found a hidden album. At first, it seemed innocuous. Photos of sunsets, selfies, random shots from her daily life. But as I scrolled further, I found pictures of her and Liam. They weren't inappropriate, just the two of them at a park, laughing together. But the way she looked at him in those photos was unmistakable. It was the way she used to look at me. I shut her phone and put it back before she finished her shower, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she'd hear it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, consumed by the weight of what I'd discovered. I replayed every moment of our marriage in my mind, searching for signs I'd missed, wondering how long this had been going on. I wanted to confront her then and there, to demand answers, to make her admit what she'd done. But I knew I wasn't ready. I needed more time, more proof. And so, I began to prepare. I hired a private investigator. It felt extreme, even paranoid, but I needed something concrete, something undeniable. If she denied the affair, I needed evidence to back up my claims. If she tried to turn the tables, I needed to protect myself. In the meantime, I played the role of the oblivious husband. I smiled when she came home late, shrugged off her excuses, and acted as if nothing had changed. It was exhausting, pretending I didn't know, pretending I wasn't drowning in my own pain. But beneath the surface, I was seething. Every laugh she shared with Liam, every moment she spent away from me, every lie she told, it all chipped away at the love I once had for her. What Emma didn't know was that the man she thought she was fooling had already begun building his exit plan. 2 weeks into the investigation, I received the report from the private investigator. I'll never forget sitting at my desk, my hands trembling as I opened the file. It felt like Pandora's box. Once opened, I couldn't unsee what was inside. There were photos, time-stamped and dated. Emma and Liam at a restaurant, sitting close in a dimly lit corner. Walking hand in hand in a park where we used to go. His car parked outside our house late at night when I was conveniently working overtime. And the one that gutted me most, Emma leaving his apartment in the early hours of the morning, her hair tied back, wearing the clothes she'd worn the night before. It was real. The affair wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a fact. The report also included records of her movements. Trips she told me were work-related, but were actually rendezvous with Liam. It was like I'd been living in a parallel universe where my wife's life was one thing to me and something entirely different behind my back. I sat there for hours, staring at the evidence, my heart pounding in my chest. The anger I felt was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the audacity, the way they'd flaunted their affair as if I didn't exist. By the time Emma came home that evening, I was calm. Or at least I looked calm. I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront her yet. Not until I had a plan. She kissed me on the cheek when she walked in, her smile bright, her tone cheerful. "How was your day?" she asked, setting her bag down on the counter. "Busy," I replied, forcing a smile. "Yours?" "Oh, the usual," she said casually, pouring herself a glass of wine. "Meetings, errands, you know how it is." It was surreal, watching her lie to my face with such ease. I wondered if she even felt guilty, or if the affair had become so normalized for her that she didn't care. As the days passed, I began putting my plan into motion. I visited a divorce lawyer, bringing along the evidence I'd gathered. The lawyer was impressed by how thorough I'd been. "This will hold up in court," he said, flipping through the photos and records. "You're in a strong position here." That gave me some measure of comfort, but it didn't erase the ache in my chest. I started taking inventory of our shared assets, the house, the cars, the savings. The lawyer advised me to separate our finances, so I opened a new account and began slowly transferring funds. I didn't want to leave her with nothing, but I also wasn't going to let her take advantage of me any longer. The hardest part was pretending everything was fine. I had to play my role convincingly, even as my heart broke a little more each time I looked at her. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to demand she explain herself, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. But I stayed silent, biding my time. And then, as if fate were mocking me, Emma came to me one night with tears in her eyes. "I feel like we've been drifting apart," she said, her voice trembling. I stared at her, trying to gauge whether this was genuine or just another manipulation. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She sat down beside me on the couch, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I don't know," she said. I want us to be closer again. I feel like we've lost something." The irony of her words nearly made me laugh. But instead, I reached out and placed a hand on hers. "We can work on it," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She smiled, and for a moment, I felt the ghost of the woman I used to know. But it was fleeting, and the weight of her betrayal loomed too large to ignore. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and made a promise to myself. When the time came, I wouldn't hold back. I would confront her, and I would take back control of my life. For now, I would wait, but not for much longer. The charade couldn't last forever. The more I pretended, the harder it became to keep my emotions in check. Every smile Emma gave me, every casual touch, every lie she wove into our daily life felt like an additional weight pressing down on my chest. And Liam? He still hung around the edges of my life, oblivious, or maybe just indifferent, to the damage he'd caused. It was a Friday night when everything finally came to a head. Emma had told me earlier in the week that she'd be out with the girls that evening. By now, her excuses barely fazed me. I already knew where she'd be. But that night, I decided I'd had enough of pretending. After she left, I waited an hour before getting into my car. I knew exactly where she was going, Liam's apartment. The private investigator had given me his address, and I'd already confirmed the patterns of her movements. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I drove, my mind racing with anger and the need for answers. When I arrived, her car was already parked outside, its familiar shape bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. My stomach churned as I sat there, staring at it, the final nail in the coffin of my denial. I stepped out of the car, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and made my way to the building's entrance. My heart pounded as I climbed the stairs to Liam's door, my fists clenching and unclenching at my sides. I didn't knock. I didn't give myself time to second-guess. I twisted the doorknob, and to my surprise, it opened. They didn't hear me at first. The sound of laughter and muffled conversation floated from the living room, and when I stepped inside, I saw them. Emma and Liam, sitting close on the couch, wine glasses in hand, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. "Having a good time?" I asked, my voice low but steady. Emma froze, her face paling as she turned to look at me. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam stood, his expression shifting from surprise to something that looked like guilt, though I doubted he was capable of feeling it. "Hey man, this isn't—" "Save it," I snapped, cutting him off. My eyes were locked on Emma. "I think you owe me an explanation." She stood, setting her wine glass down with trembling hands. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice trembling. I let out a bitter laugh, pulling out my phone and scrolling to the photos and videos I'd gathered over the past weeks. I held the screen up so she could see. "You're going to tell me it's not what it looks like?" I asked, my voice dripping with disbelief. Her mouth opened, then closed, no words coming out. Liam shifted uncomfortably, looking between the two of us as if he were searching for an escape route. "I trusted you," I said, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to stay composed. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? With him?" I jabbed a finger in Liam's direction. Emma started to cry, the tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." "You never meant to hurt me?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You've been lying to me for months. Don't stand there and act like this was some accident. You made a choice, 100 choices, and every single one of them betrayed me." Liam tried to interject, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Look, maybe we should all calm down." "Shut up, Liam," I snapped, the anger boiling over. You're not my friend. You're a snake. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before turning back to Emma. We're done, I said, my voice firm. When you come home, pack your things. You can stay with him, for all I care. She reached for me, her voice desperate. Please, we can fix this. I love you. I stepped back, out of her reach, shaking my head. You don't love me, I said quietly. You love yourself. And I'm done being the fool who believed otherwise. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door, leaving them both standing in stunned silence. When I got into my car, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight I'd been carrying for months had finally lifted. But beneath that relief was a deep, aching sorrow. The woman I'd loved, the life we'd built together, it was all gone. And as I drove away, one thought echoed in my mind. This was only the beginning. The morning after I confronted Emma and Liam, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had control over my life again. But it wasn't enough just to walk away. I needed to reclaim what was mine and ensure that neither Emma nor Liam could take advantage of me any further. I'd been preparing for this moment, and now it was time to act. First, I made a call to the dealership where I'd purchased the car I'd gifted Emma for our anniversary 2 years ago. The car was in my name, fully paid off. Within hours, I arranged for it to be picked up. She won't need it anymore, I told the agent on the phone, my voice steady. Next, I spoke to my lawyer. The evidence I'd gathered was already in his hands, but now I needed to take the next step, eviction. Our home was solely under my name, purchased before we were married, and protected by a prenup Emma had signed. I want her out, I told him. She'll fight it, my lawyer warned. She might claim emotional distress or try to delay the process. Let her try, I replied. I'm done playing nice. That evening, Emma came home, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She tried to talk to me, but I didn't let her. I've already said everything I needed to say, I told her, standing firm. The car is being repossessed, and you'll need to find somewhere else to stay. I've spoken to my lawyer. You'll be served divorce papers within the week. She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. You can't just throw me out, she cried. Watch me, I said coldly. This is my house, Emma. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences. She begged, pleaded, tried to reason with me, but I'd already made up my mind. I was done letting her manipulate me with tears and empty promises. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Movers arrived to pack up Emma's things while I stayed out of the house, unable to bear the sight of her sorting through the remnants of our life together. I received updates from my lawyer about the divorce proceedings, which included a no-fault clause given the overwhelming evidence of her infidelity. Emma tried to contact me multiple times, leaving voicemails and sending long-winded texts apologizing, promising to change, swearing that Liam meant nothing to her. I ignored every message, blocking her number and redirecting all communication through my lawyer. Liam, on the other hand, had the audacity to show up at my office one afternoon. He looked disheveled, his usual confidence replaced by something desperate. Can we talk? He asked, his voice low. No, I said, barely looking at him as I walked past. Please, man, I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he continued, following me into the lobby. I stopped and turned to face him, my eyes narrowing. You didn't mean for this to happen? I repeated, my voice cold. You slept with my wife, Liam. Repeatedly. You lied to me, betrayed my trust, and destroyed my marriage. Don't stand there and act like you're the victim. He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I don't want things to get worse between us. Things can't get worse, I said. You're dead to me. Stay out of my life. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his shoulders slumped. By the end of the week, Emma had moved out of the house. The sight of her empty closet, the absence of her things, should have brought me peace, but instead, it left me hollow. The life we'd built together was gone, dismantled piece by piece, and all that remained was the bitter taste of betrayal. That weekend, I sat in the quiet of my now empty home, reflecting on everything that had happened. For 6 years, I'd believed in a version of Emma that no longer existed, or maybe never had. The woman I loved had chosen someone else, and in doing so, she'd torn apart the foundation of our life together. But as painful as it was, I knew one thing for certain. I was free. Free to rebuild, to move forward, to reclaim the pieces of myself that I'd lost along the way. The storm was over, but the road ahead was long. And for the first time in months, I felt ready to take the first step. The silence in the house was deafening after Emma left. It was strange. This space that once felt alive now seemed hollow, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the pain of what had transpired. I spent the first few days just existing, moving from one room to the next, unsure of what to do with myself. I'd packed away the framed photos of us, tucked them into a box in the garage, along with other memories I couldn't yet face. Her favorite mug sat untouched in the cabinet, and the faint scent of her perfume still lingered in the bedroom. It was like she'd left ghostly imprints of herself everywhere, haunting me. For the first time in years, I was alone, not just physically but emotionally. I didn't know who to reach out to or what to say. How do you explain to someone that your marriage has collapsed, that the person you trusted most betrayed you in the worst way? I found some solace in routine. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects and spending long hours at the office. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to stop myself from spiraling. It wasn't sustainable, but it helped me get through the first few weeks. The evenings were the hardest. Coming home to an empty house, knowing that I no longer had someone waiting for me, was a gut punch every single time. I'd sit in the quiet, nursing a drink, staring at the space where she used to sit on the couch. One night, as I scrolled through my phone, I came across an old playlist Emma and I had made together. Each song brought back memories, road trips, lazy Sundays, dancing in the kitchen. I turned it off halfway through, unable to handle the wave of emotions it unleashed. But amidst the pain, there were moments of clarity. I began to realize just how much of myself I'd given away during our marriage, how I'd lost pieces of who I was trying to keep her happy. I'd compromised, bent over backward, and ignored my own needs for the sake of preserving something that, in hindsight, wasn't worth saving. I started making changes. The first was the house. I couldn't live in the space where everything had fallen apart, where every corner reminded me of what I'd lost. I reached out to a realtor, and within weeks, I'd put it on the market. Next, I reconnected with old friends. People I drifted away from during my marriage, either because I was too busy or because Emma had taken center stage in my life. One of them, Mark, had been my college roommate, and catching up with him felt like rediscovering a part of myself I'd forgotten. "You're better off without her," he said one night over beers. "She didn't deserve you." It was a simple sentiment, but hearing it from someone who knew me so well made it feel real. I also returned to hobbies I'd abandoned: reading, hiking, even tinkering with old cars in my garage. These little acts of reclaiming my identity felt like tiny victories, reminders that there was life beyond Emma, beyond the pain. The divorce process moved forward with surprising speed. Thanks to the prenup and the overwhelming evidence of her infidelity, things were fairly straightforward. Emma didn't fight for much, likely realizing she had no ground to stand on. When the papers were finalized, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, anger, and even a small glimmer of hope. It was over. But what surprised me most were the moments of gratitude. As much as the betrayal had broken me, it had also forced me to reevaluate my life, to take stock of who I was and what I wanted. For the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of something I hadn't experienced in months: possibility. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was mine to walk, and for that, I was grateful. In the weeks after the divorce was finalized, life started to take on a new rhythm. It wasn't easy. There were still days when I'd wake up and feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. But slowly, the wounds began to scab over. Selling the house was a milestone I didn't know I needed. The moment I handed over the keys to the new owners, it felt like I was closing a chapter. That house, once a symbol of love and partnership, had become a monument to betrayal. Letting it go was liberating. I moved into a smaller place, a cozy apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't much, but it was mine, free from the memories that had haunted me. I spent the first week arranging furniture, hanging art, and filling the shelves with books I'd been meaning to read for years. The quiet felt different here. It wasn't the suffocating silence of the house. It was peaceful, a blank slate. I threw myself into my new life with a determination I hadn't felt in years. I joined a hiking group and started spending weekends exploring trails I'd never known existed. I went to the gym more often, not just to stay in shape, but to clear my head. And I started saying yes to things I'd once avoided: impromptu dinners with friends, weekend road trips, even karaoke nights. Despite my lack of singing talent, Emma still lingered in the back of my mind, of course. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about her, wondering what she was doing, whether she was still with Liam. But the thought didn't sting as much as it used to. One evening, Mark invited me to a party at his place. It was a casual gathering, a mix of old friends and people I'd never met. I wasn't sure I wanted to go, but Mark insisted. "You need to get out more," he said. "You've spent enough time brooding." He wasn't wrong. At the party, I found myself talking to a woman named Claire. She was easy to talk to, smart, funny, with a sharp wit that kept me on my toes. We spent most of the night in a corner, swapping stories about bad dates and our favorite books. When the party wound down, Claire handed me her number. "Call me if you ever want to grab a coffee," she said with a smile. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was a start. In the days that followed, I began to realize how much lighter I felt. I'd spent so long carrying the weight of my marriage's collapse, but now, the load was starting to lift. I wasn't fully healed, far from it, but I was beginning to see that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about learning to live with it, to let it shape me without defining me. One afternoon, I received an unexpected message. It was from Emma. "I hope you're doing okay," she wrote. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I know I hurt you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." I stared at the message for a long time before closing it without responding. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need closure from her, because I was already finding it on my own. For the first time in what felt like forever, I looked toward the future with a sense of hope. My life wasn't what I'd planned, but it was mine, and that was enough. 6 months after the dust settled, my life was unrecognizable from what it had been during those dark days. The pain of betrayal hadn't disappeared entirely. It never does, but it no longer controlled me. It was a scar, a reminder of where I'd been and how far I'd come. Claire and I had gone on a handful of dates by then, and while we weren't rushing into anything serious, her presence was a breath of fresh air. She reminded me that connection was still possible, that the world was filled with people who could bring light into my life. There were moments when I'd catch myself comparing her to Emma, but I'd quickly stop. Claire deserved better than to be a shadow of my past, and I deserved better than to keep living in it. The apartment had become a reflection of the person I was becoming. Photos of friends, art I'd picked up from local markets, and a bookshelf overflowing with paperbacks made it feel like home. The space wasn't filled with memories of Emma. It was filled with me. Liam, unsurprisingly, had faded from my life entirely. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that his relationship with Emma had fizzled out just a few weeks after I confronted them. Apparently, Liam wasn't looking for anything serious, and Emma's world had come crashing down when she realized he wasn't the answer she thought he'd be. The idea of her heartbreak used to bring me a sense of vindication, but now, it just felt empty. I wasn't interested in revenge or keeping tabs on her life. She was my past, and that's where she belonged. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old boxes I'd kept in storage, I came across the photo album from our wedding. I hadn't seen it in years. Emma had been the one to keep it in her drawer. I flipped through the pages, pausing on images of us smiling, surrounded by friends and family, so full of hope. There was a time when I thought those moments were the foundation of something unshakable, something that would last forever. But now, I saw them for what they were. Snapshots of a love that had been flawed from the start, despite my best intentions. I closed the album and set it aside. It wasn't anger I felt, it was gratitude. Gratitude for the good times we'd shared, for the lessons I'd learned, and for the chance to start over. The next morning, I drove to a nearby lake. It was one of the places I'd rediscovered during my hikes, a spot I'd grown to love for its stillness and beauty. As I sat by the water, Watching the sunlight dance on the surface, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Life doesn't always turn out the way we plan. Sometimes it takes us through storms we don't think we'll survive. But those storms shape us, strengthen us, and give us the chance to rebuild. I wasn't the man I was when Emma and I said, "I do." And that was okay. That version of me was gone. But the man sitting by the lake that day, he was stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever came next. As I stood to leave, I took one last look at the water, breathing in the crisp air. And then, I walked forward, leaving the past behind.